Hi, my name is Gia. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my childhood, I believed I was the lucky one. While my friends spent every summer stuck at home, I got to spend mine at my Aunt Evelyn's cozy little house by the lake. She baked fresh blueberry pies, let me stay up late watching old movies, and never forgot my favorite hot chocolate. I honestly thought I had the best summers of anyone I knew. It took me 20 years to realize those weren't gifts. They were excuses. For 8 summers in a row, my parents packed my suitcase, hugged me goodbye, smiled like they were doing something wonderful for me, and sent me away. So they could enjoy perfect family vacations. Without me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it all began. I was 10 years old the first summer it happened. My parents, Richard and Melissa, sat me down after dinner with unusually cheerful smiles. My younger brother, Ethan, who was 8, was bouncing in his chair, practically vibrating with excitement. Gia, Mom said sweetly, guess what? Aunt Evelyn would love to have you stay with her for the summer. I remember clapping my hands. Really? The whole summer? Mom nodded. She misses you so much. Dad smiled. You'll have so much fun fishing, baking cookies, and swimming at the lake. I looked at Ethan. Aren't you coming too? Before he could answer, Mom quickly interrupted. No, sweetheart. Ethan has summer baseball. That made sense. At least it did to a 10-year-old. I hugged everyone goodbye 2 days later and left with Aunt Evelyn. She lived nearly 4 hours away in a peaceful little town where everyone knew everyone. Her house smelled like cinnamon, old books, and fresh coffee. Every morning we'd feed ducks at the lake. Every Friday we'd visit the farmer's market. She made me feel loved, important, safe. When school started again, Mom and Dad picked me up. They brought me a pink t-shirt that said, Best Daughter Ever. I wore it proudly. Then I noticed Ethan had a tan. Not just a little tan. The kind of tan kids get after weeks on the beach. Your baseball season was outside? I asked. He shrugged. I guess. Mom answered before he could say anything else. They practiced every day. I believed her. Because children believe their parents. The next summer, it happened again. We already talked to Aunt Evelyn, Mom announced over breakfast. She can't wait to see you. I smiled. I can't wait either. Ethan looked strangely disappointed. Can I go with Gia? Dad laughed. No, buddy. You have soccer camp. Again, it sounded reasonable. So off I went. Another beautiful summer. Another season of homemade pies. Another collection of happy memories with my aunt. When I returned home in August, Ethan had a seashell collection sitting on his dresser. Where'd you get those? I asked. He froze. Mom answered from the kitchen. Oh, the school fair. I nodded. Didn't think twice. Kids don't investigate. They trust. By the 3rd summer, I had stopped asking questions. Packing became routine. Mom folded my clothes. Dad loaded the car. Ethan hugged me goodbye. Aunt Evelyn welcomed me with open arms. Everything felt normal. One evening while helping Aunt Evelyn water her flowers, I casually asked something that made her stop for just a second. Do Mom and Dad ever visit while I'm gone? She looked surprised. No, sweetheart. I thought maybe they came here after dropping me off. She smiled gently. They've always seemed busy. I didn't think much of it. Looking back now, that tiny pause before she answered should have told me something. Years passed. Summer after summer. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, then the 8th. Every year there was a new excuse. Ethan had baseball, then soccer, then a science camp, then leadership camp, then football training. Something always prevented him from coming. And somehow, I never questioned why those activities always lasted exactly as long as my stay with Aunt Evelyn. Life has a funny way of hiding the truth in plain sight. By the time I turned 18, I had grown incredibly close to Aunt Evelyn. She wasn't rich. She wasn't flashy. But she listened. She remembered every birthday, every exam, every heartbreak. She celebrated my achievements more enthusiastically than my own parents ever did. When I graduated high school, Aunt Evelyn cried. Mom barely looked up from her phone. Dad shook my hand instead of hugging me. At the time, I convinced myself they just weren't emotional people. Excuses. I made so many excuses for them. College came. I moved into a dorm. Life became busy. The summer trip stopped because I was working internships. For the first time in years, I spent summers making my own choices. I assumed my parents probably stayed home now too. I never asked. Then one evening, when I was 26, everything changed. I had driven to Aunt Evelyn's house for a weekend visit. She was cleaning her attic. Boxes covered the floor. Old photo albums were stacked everywhere. "Gia," she called. "Can you hand me that blue box?" I climbed the ladder and grabbed it. As I lifted it, a thick envelope slid out and landed on the floor. Photographs scattered everywhere. I bent down to pick them up. The first picture made me smile. It was me and Aunt Evelyn baking cookies. The second showed us fishing. The third made my stomach tighten. It wasn't me. It was Mom, Dad, Ethan, standing in front of a giant cruise ship. All three were smiling. Ethan looked about 10 years old, exactly the age he supposedly spent at baseball camp. I frowned. Maybe this wasn't from the same year. Then another photo slipped into my hands. Disney World. Mom wearing mouse ears. Dad holding Ethan on his shoulders. Another. Hawaii. Another. The Grand Canyon. Another. Yellowstone. Another. Universal Studios. Every picture was dated. Every single one. Each date matched. The exact summers the first had spent with Aunt Evelyn. I stared at the growing pile of photographs. My hands started shaking. Aunt Evelyn. She looked over. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. Her eyes widened. "Oh," she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "I was hoping you'd never find those." I looked back at the photographs. Then at her. "What are these?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly sat down in an old wooden chair. She looked heartbroken, as if she'd been carrying someone else's secret for far too long. I swallowed hard. My voice barely worked. "Aunt Evelyn, why do these pictures say they were taken during the same summers? The summers the first was here?" She closed her eyes. And after nearly 20 years of silence, she finally spoke. "Gia, I think it's time you knew the truth." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The attic suddenly felt smaller. The old wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I looked from the photographs to Aunt Evelyn, hoping she'd laugh and tell me there had been some misunderstanding. Instead, she looked like someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy to hold. She folded her hands together. "I've dreaded this day for years." I swallowed hard. "Then tell me." She looked at the photos spread across the floor. "When your mother first asked me to keep you for the summer, she told me Ethan had baseball camp." I nodded slowly. "That's what they told me too." Aunt Evelyn sighed. I believed them. She paused before continuing. "But a few weeks later, your father accidentally mailed one of these vacation postcards to my house instead of yours." She reached into the envelope and pulled out a faded postcard. It showed a beautiful beach in Florida. On the back was my father's handwriting. "Wish you were here. Ethan is having the time of his life." The postcard was addressed to my parents' home, but somehow it had ended up in Aunt Evelyn's mailbox. "I called your mother," Aunt Evelyn said quietly. I thought she'd made a mistake. "What did she say?" Aunt Evelyn's shoulders dropped. "She begged me not to tell you." I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. "Why?" "She said you were mature enough to understand one day." I laughed bitterly. "Mature enough to understand what?" Aunt Evelyn looked directly into my eyes. "That traveling with one child was cheaper." The words landed like a punch. I blinked. "I'm sorry. I don't think I heard you." She closed her eyes. "They said taking 2 children on vacations cost too much." I stared at her. "They decided they could afford 1 child." Silence. "And they chose Ethan." It felt as if every memory from my childhood had suddenly changed shape. Every goodbye, every hug, every smile. None of it had been real. "They told me," Aunt Evelyn continued softly, "that you loved staying here more than vacations." I shook my head. "I never said that." "I know. They told me you preferred quiet places." I was 10. She nodded. "I know. They said Ethan needed more attention. I was a child too. I know. Every answer she gave somehow made the pain worse. I slowly sat on the dusty attic floor. I spent 8 summers thinking they were doing something special for me. Aunt Evelyn reached for my hand. They should have been honest. I looked at her. You knew all those years? She nodded with tears in her eyes. I wanted to tell you so many times. Then why didn't you? Because your mother begged me. She hesitated. And because I was afraid that if I told the truth, they'd stop letting you come here. That answer broke something inside me. Because she was right. If she had told me, my parents probably would have cut off the only person who truly made me feel loved. I squeezed her hand. I'm not angry with you. She started crying. I loved having you here. I know. You were never a burden. I know. You became the daughter I never had. I couldn't stop my own tears anymore. I know. We hugged each other for a long time. When I finally stood, I carefully gathered every photograph, every postcard, every receipt that had fallen from the envelope. Receipts from hotels, theme parks, airlines, cruises, even souvenir shops. Each one matched the summers the first had spent baking pies with Aunt Evelyn. There was no denying it. No misunderstanding. No accident. Just 8 years of deliberate choices. The drive home that evening felt endless. I barely turned on the radio. Every mile brought back another memory. Mom kissing my forehead before I left. Dad promising we'd do something special together next year. Ethan coming home with souvenirs he claimed came from school fairs. Now I knew where every shell, every snow globe, every stuffed animal had really come from. When I reached my parents' house, their porch light was on. Mom opened the door with a smile. Gia, what a surprise. I held up one photograph. Her smile disappeared instantly. Dad walked into the hallway. His face turned pale. Neither of them spoke. I placed the stack of photos on the dining table. I found these. The room became painfully quiet. Dad slowly sat down. Mom crossed her arms. It isn't what you think. I almost laughed. I've heard that sentence in movies. It never ends well. Dad rubbed his forehead. We were going to tell you someday. When? When I turned 50? When you turned 80? Mom took a deep breath. You loved Evelyn's house. That wasn't my question. She avoided my eyes. I pointed at one photo after another. Disney, Hawaii, the cruise, the Grand Canyon, Universal, Yellowstone. You took Ethan everywhere. Mom finally snapped. We couldn't afford 4 tickets. I stared at her. So you bought 3. She didn't answer. Dad spoke quietly. We thought you wouldn't mind. I felt my jaw tighten. You never asked me. Mom sighed impatiently. You always seemed happy. I was happy. Because I believed my parents loved me equally. Dad stood. We did love you equally. I looked straight at him. No, you didn't. You loved me when it was convenient. You chose him when it wasn't. Mom shook her head. That's not fair. Really? I pointed toward the photographs. Which summer did you choose me? Neither of them answered. Not one word. Finally, Ethan walked into the kitchen. He was 29 now. He looked from me to the photographs. Then his face changed. Oh, he knew. I looked directly at him. You remember every vacation. He nodded slowly. I do. You lied to me. His voice was barely above a whisper. I was a kid. So was I. He looked down. I wanted to tell you. When? He had no answer. The silence said everything. I looked around the dining room. Family portraits covered the walls. There were dozens of pictures. Birthdays. Christmas. Graduations. Then I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. There wasn't a single vacation photo that included me. Not one. Because I had never been there. I had been carefully edited out of those memories before they were even made. Mom noticed where I was looking. We didn't want to hurt your feelings. I turned toward her. You framed them. She looked confused. The vacation pictures. You displayed them in your house. You looked at them every day. You remembered leaving me behind every single time. She burst into tears. We made mistakes. I shook my head. No. A mistake happens once. This happened for 8 summers. That's a decision. Dad tried to step closer. Gia. I held up my hand. No. I spent years wondering why Ethan always seemed closer to you. Now I know. You built memories with him. You gave me away every summer. My voice cracked. And I thanked you for it. No one spoke. I wiped my eyes. Then I picked up the envelope. I'm keeping these. Mom whispered. Please don't hate us. I looked at her for a long moment. I don't hate you. I just don't recognize you anymore. With that, I walked out the front door. Behind me, I could hear my mother crying. My father calling my name. Ethan apologizing. But none of it could change one simple truth. For 8 summers, they had chosen the family they wanted. And it wasn't me. I thought leaving that house would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. I had no idea that my parents were about to lose far more than my forgiveness. I didn't speak to my parents for almost a year after that night. At first, they called every day, then every week, then only on birthdays and holidays. I answered none of them. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Distance isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's protection. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to earn my parents' love. Instead, I started building a life where I didn't need to. I threw myself into work. After graduating with a degree in marketing years earlier, I'd worked my way up through different companies. By the time I was 30, I had become the marketing director for a growing outdoor lifestyle brand. The job paid well, but more importantly, it gave me confidence. I bought my first condo, traveled to places I'd only seen in those old family photographs. Florida, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, even Hawaii. Every destination felt bittersweet. Sometimes I'd stand there wondering what it would have been like to experience these places as a child with parents who actually wanted me there. Then I'd remind myself, I was here now, and this memory belonged to me, not to them. The one person who stayed by my side through everything was Aunt Evelyn. We spoke almost every day. I visited her every month. On my 31st birthday, she handed me a small wooden box. I've been saving this for you. Inside was every postcard my parents had accidentally sent over those 8 summers. Every receipt, every brochure, every little reminder of the truth. I don't want these, I said quietly. She smiled. They're not for revenge. They're proof. Proof of what? That none of it was your fault. I hugged her tighter than I ever had before. You saved me. She smiled through tears. No, sweetheart. You saved yourself. About 6 months later, my phone rang. The caller ID read, Dad. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Hello. His voice sounded older. Tired. Gia. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I stayed silent. He took a deep breath. I've been diagnosed with heart disease. For a moment, every bit of anger inside me disappeared. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because illness changes people. I'm sorry to hear that. I'd like to see you. I'll think about it. A week later, I visited my parents' house for the first time since walking out. Everything looked smaller, older. Even the paint on the walls seemed faded. Mom opened the door. She looked like she'd aged 10 years. Without saying a word, she hugged me. I didn't hug her back, but I didn't pull away either. Dad was sitting in the living room. He stood slowly when he saw me. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. He nodded. I deserve that. For the next hour, we talked. Really talked. For the first time in my life, they stopped making excuses. Dad admitted they'd convinced themselves I wouldn't mind because I was the easy child. Mom admitted she had been afraid I'd complain during expensive trips because I was quieter and more sensitive than Ethan. So you took the child who made less work for you and left her behind? Mom broke down crying. When you say it like that, that's exactly how it sounds. Because that's exactly what happened. There was no arguing with the truth anymore. Then Dad said something I'd never expected. We've rewritten our wills. I frowned. What does that have to do with me? He looked at Mom before answering. We divided everything equally. I couldn't help letting out a sad little laugh. You think this is about money? He looked confused. It's never been about money. It was about being chosen. You can't rewrite my childhood. No one spoke. Finally, I stood. I appreciate the apology. I really do. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Mom whispered, "Can we start over?" I looked around the room. At the family portraits. At the same walls that had once displayed all those vacation memories. Some of those pictures were gone now. Empty spaces remained where the frames had hung. "I don't think we can start over." Their faces fell. "But we can start from where we are. It'll take time. If you're willing to earn trust instead of expecting it." Dad nodded immediately. "We are. I'll believe that when your actions prove it." Over the next year, something surprising happened. They actually tried. Not with expensive gifts. Not with guilt. Not with excuses. With consistency. Dad called once a week just to ask how work was going. Mom learned to listen instead of defending herself. They visited Aunt Evelyn and thanked her for giving me the childhood they hadn't. Mom cried the entire visit. She apologized to Aunt Evelyn over and over. My aunt simply smiled. "I didn't raise Gia because I was doing you a favor. I raised her because she deserved to feel loved." Even Ethan changed. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet for coffee. He looked nervous. "I owe you more than an apology. You were a kid." "I know, but I still remember every vacation." He looked down. "I should have asked where you were." I smiled sadly. "You trusted Mom and Dad." "So did I." He slid a small photo album across the table. "I've been putting this together." Inside were copies of every vacation photo. Except, he had written notes beside each one. "This should have included you. We should have waited until we could all go. I'm sorry." By the final page, I was crying. Not because of the pictures. Because someone had finally admitted what I'd needed to hear all along. You were left out. And it was wrong. No excuses. No explanations. Just the truth. A few months later, I planned a family trip. Not to Disney. Not to Hawaii. Just a quiet cabin by a lake. The same lake where Aunt Evelyn had spent those summers with me. This time, everyone came. Mom, Dad, Ethan, his wife, Aunt Evelyn. On the second evening, we sat around a bonfire. Dad looked at the lake and smiled. I never realized how beautiful this place was. Aunt Evelyn chuckled. "You would have known. If you'd ever visited your daughter." Nobody laughed. Dad lowered his head. I deserved that. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry, Gia. For all 8 summers." I looked at the fire for a long moment before answering. "I believe you. And that's enough for tonight." As the flames danced in the darkness, I realized something. Those 8 summers had been stolen from me. But they had also given me something my parents never could. A woman who loved me without conditions. A safe place. A second home. And the strength to know my worth was never determined by who chose me, but by the life I chose to build afterward. If I could speak to that 10-year-old little girl packing her suitcase for Aunt Evelyn's house, I'd tell her this. One day, you'll discover why they kept sending you away. It will break your heart, but it will never break you. Because sometimes, the family that truly saves you is the one that never had to.